Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back, and now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to be digging into the emotional roller coaster that divorcing dads face, including why they're at higher risk for suicide and the heavy societal and psychological burdens that weigh them down. My guest today is Dr. Eran Magen. He is a Stanford University-educated expert. He has a master's in education and a Ph.D. in psychology, and he founded an organization called divorceddads.org. He is the founder and CEO of Early Alert, which prevents suicide among students in school, colleges, and universities. He's also the founder of Parenting for Humans, which helps parents build more joy and collaborative relationships with their children. And of course, as I said, divorcingdads.org, which helps divorced fathers stay healthy, sane, and connected to their children. This is such a great conversation. Eran and I got into some really deep waters, and I really loved having him on and talking to him. And I know that, most of you guys are moms, but I think it's really important to hear this perspective because there's empathy involved in the experience of fathers. And while so many of us are trying so hard to fight the systems that, favor men, say in family court and all of those things, really getting under the hood and looking at the experience that, as I said, the societal and psychological burdens that they carry, the isolation, the loneliness, the despair, the way that our society does not support men in these emotionally trying times and how hard it is for them to therefore reach out. It puts them at such high risk, and we need to understand that as we move forward. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Eran Magen. Eran, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us all things divorced dads.
My great pleasure.
Really important topic, and I'm really glad you're doing the work that you're doing. You talk about, somewhere you had the statistics, and of course they're gone from my brain because my brain doesn't like to retain statistics, but if yours does, great. The statistics on the risk of suicide from divorcing men. Do you have those statistics in your head?
I do, but I should first tell you that one of the first things I learned about statistics is that 87% of them are made up.
Can you cite that?
I can, yeah, straight to myself. But the risk is real. Yeah, I mean, men in general tend to die by suicide more than women. Women attempt more, men tend to die more. They use more lethal means. Among men, when you look at different categories of relationship status, so widower, single, married, divorced men are more than twice as likely to die by suicide than any other category of men, and more than 4 times as likely than women to die by suicide in general. But again, there's already a bump just by virtue of being male. Yeah, so it's a big risk. Yeah. It's a very real risk. Something to think about if you are or if you know somebody who's going through a divorce.
And I will say, a lot of my audience being the women and the wives who are often delivering the news, I hear this all the time from them. huge number of threats as soon as they get the news. And then a lot of them actually either attempting or following through, either in front of the children, in front of their wife and children, really scary stuff. Why is this? Why is this such a devastating experience that men seem to not have the support to get through?
Well, I think you gave the answer in the question.
I kind of did, didn't I?
Yeah, I think it's about the support. I think in American culture, certainly, and maybe in general in Western culture even, men are not really brought up and encouraged to form strong, intimate, vulnerable, emotional connections with other people. And they usually end up finding this in their family. And so you'll see men being often very close with their spouses. You'll see men being very close and emotionally, very different with their kids than with anyone else. Pets get the same kind of preferred treatment from a lot of men. It also means that once all this goes away, they're left completely alone and reeling, just stuck in their head while pretending to be okay, but because that's also a big part of what society has taught them to do up to that point.
Yeah.
And it's just such a potent recipe for unmitigated distress. There's a very elegant theory of what brings about suicide or suicidality. It's called the three-step theory of suicide, appropriately. And it says that if you're experiencing a huge amount of pain and you have no hope that the pain will go away and you have nothing that you feel connected to, you will try to kill yourself. I think the theory itself doesn't state it quite as prescriptively as I just did, but that's the idea. And each one of those things also becomes a protective factor once you flip it over, right? So you might be in a lot of pain and you may not see a time that you're coming out of that pain, but if you're strongly connected to someone or something, if you have a strong sense of mission, or you're clear about people loving you and caring about you, or people that you love and care about and want to help and support, this will keep you from trying to check out. But all this is gone if you're the kind of person whose only emotional outlet and connection is the family, and then suddenly that goes away. And very often, at least in the initial stages of divorce, if there's any kind of adversity, the men initially have a lot less time with the kids and maybe later regain it. Right. But initially, kids are typically assigned to the mom. They're just left completely alone and reeling and questioning their worth and their place, and have no one to talk to. Or rather, don't reach out to anyone. There are people to talk to, but men rarely make use of it.
Right. There's so many. So why don't men do this? I mean, obviously we socialize them, right? But we're in a place where we have so much information about this. We are on information overload about mental health and, avenues for change and all of the information we need for how to not reach this critical place is so readily available. It's not hidden. This is not a big secret. Why are men still resisting this?
I'll insert two small caveats, right? One is it's maybe men on average more than other people, but I wouldn't say all the men are like that. And
No, sure.
And I think the word resisting can be problematic in this context, right? I don't know that they're resisting anything in particular. Sometimes I think the option just doesn't occur. Sometimes I think people are afraid to reach out and admit weakness. Sometimes people are ashamed or embarrassed even about going through a divorce. And to say I need support around this might then lead you to have to start talking about things. Maybe you cheated on your wife. Maybe your wife cheated on you. Either way, that doesn't sound great when you talk about it with people and you're upset and emotional. It's clear that it's a vulnerable move to reach out to others for support. And I think a lot of men are not great with being vulnerable because there's not that much training about this, right? There's not so much socialization that pushes men to be vulnerable and emotional. Most of the socialization traditionally has been about being stoic and silent and strong and so on. We might be seeing a generational shift now. That would be lovely, right? If we see these statistics change when the next batch of 30-year-olds starts divorcing in 10 years, it might be different. Maybe it's starting to be different even now.
Yeah.
But I also would not underestimate the impact of ignorance, of actually not knowing about the resources that are available. Because I don't know that a lot of men walk around apertures wide open, Hearing about the various crisis lines and hotlines and support groups that exist, it's just not the kind of thing that a lot of men walk through life paying a lot of attention to, because their job in their minds is to handle it, carry it, right? Be strong and carry on.
And these are not conversations that, like, let's say Joe Rogan is having. Like,
I couldn't tell you, honestly.
Yeah, good. Yeah, me neither. But I'm pretty sure vulnerability in masculinity is not something that he's having a conversation about.
I would not discount the information gap that exists between men and women about this. And then, of course, the motivation gap, or the willingness gap, or the fear gap about being exposed and vulnerable, and just the availability, right? It is easier to talk to a friend than to a random stranger on a hotline in some sense. And many men don't have that close friend.
What's so interesting, though, is like when faced with the option, if there's information ignorance aside, right? Let's assume they know that it's out there, right? I've heard men say to my clients, I'd rather get divorced than go to therapy. Right. And in a sense, sometimes some men might be saying, like, I would rather die by suicide than face any of what has to be faced for healing here.
This is not something I encountered personally. My personal experience has been that when people are in great pain and you're there and you care, they shock themselves by how much they open up. I think that there's an initial fear, definitely, about reaching out to someone and admitting that pain and that level of hopelessness. But as soon as it gets going, people are, we love talking about ourselves. Doesn't matter what we have, a Y or an X chromosome. This is part of why it's so important to check in with people, because so often people will not ask for support. But when you check in with them in a way that feels sincere to them, they will tell you how they're doing. And from there, you can start either supporting them or connecting them with potential source of support. But that's a major thing, to check in with people and see how they're doing regularly after hard things happen, right? Not just divorce, but like somebody grieving anything, right? Somebody important died, you lost something important in your life, and being the person that checks in every so often for the weeks and months that follow, not just a couple of days after you heard about it.
Exactly. Because that's the time where people tend to drop off, right? Is in the later stages, a couple of weeks out, a couple of months out, a year out.
Yeah. Especially if you're locked in the echo chamber of your own head.
Yeah.
Right? You talk to less and less people and you kind of pretend everything's okay, but then walk around the world feeling increasingly discouraged because of the thoughts in your head that you're not sharing with anyone, because you're not sure anybody cares.
That's right. Do you have sort of ways that you feel that men can create these stronger relationships and connections with each other, but also, with other people in their lives, with their kids, right? Like how do you help men actually connect?
That's a huge question. And I think goes in the right direction, right? Because now you're talking prevention in a sense, right? How do we put these protective factors in place before something terrible happens? And the terrible thing might be a divorce or might be something else. And I do think it's a socialization issue. And I do think a big part of it is the parenting that's done today, right? What are we training the kids? Are we saying it's okay to express emotions or not? It's important to be stoic or not, right? So a lot of this, in a way, I would put in the lap of the parents, in thinking about how do we encourage kids who are emotionally open and available, not afraid of having emotions, not afraid of discussing emotions. And a lot of this can be done by modeling this to our kids, to talk with them about their emotions, maybe about our emotions in a way that's age appropriate.
Absolutely. All right. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk a lot more about that, because I think this is incredibly important. So we'll be right back after this break from our sponsors. Okay. So before the break, we were talking about parenting, which is really one of your big sweet spots.
Yeah, huge passion.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about sort of this, what I heard you say was sort of this connective parenting. How do people who are, let's say, disconnected from themselves and their emotions, and they don't allow themselves to have emotions, how do they foster that in their children? Or how do they even know that that's what they're supposed to be doing, if that's where the shift lies, right?
Most people connect to something. And I alluded to this before too, where you might have men that seem very generally quiet, maybe stoic, but you'll see them getting around on the carpet and rolling with the dog or with the kid, right? Until the kid hits a certain age, maybe. But most people, including most men, will connect emotionally to something and be playful with it and be silly with it and be vulnerable with it. Although it's a different kind of vulnerability, obviously, to say that you're sad than to pretend that you are, a goblin princess or whatever is happening in the game. One thing that is good to watch out for in ourselves as parents is there a point when our kid does something and we go, don't do that? And it's not a dangerous thing. It's not a physical danger, right? We just see something that feels like totally off to us, and to just stop for a second before we reprimand the child and tell them not to do that, to think, like, where is this coming from? Do I really think that's a bad thing or not? Right? And maybe we already reprimanded. Maybe we think about it in our own head and we say, what? Why did that hit me so hard?
Yeah.
Right? When he started crying, when he lost the soccer match, like, why was it so important for me to say, don't do this? And it's, part of my work is with veterans kind of in a different field. And it's interesting to hear them talk about emotions, because a lot of veterans who've been through combat and have been, essentially trained to take it and keep going will later talk about the importance of acknowledging emotions. Otherwise, something gets too bottled up and it becomes bad. People down the road, people figure it out that this is important.
I see this because I watch a lot of true crime. I will see this with older, retired homicide detectives, where they're sitting there and they're talking about a case from 20 years ago and they just start to cry. I always love those moments, because it's like, wow, I'm pretty sure you didn't do that in the moment because you couldn't. But the fact that you are in your, 60s or 70s and you're like back in that moment and you're like a homicide detective, right? Like that they're showing that level of emotion. I always love it. I love it so much, because it's just kind of like there's such a tenderness to it.
Yeah, you see past the mask suddenly, right? They're stepping out of the armor. Circle back to your question. I'm not comfortable saying, oh, treat them differently when they're kids so they can connect with other, because there are a lot of people who are grown-ups now and it doesn't really apply to them. And the question is, what do we do now? And I would say, for men, start small. If you're going to your whatever group thing you're going to, right? You're doing jiu-jitsu, you're in your running club, you have a biking group, you go out doing things, I don't know. If there's somebody that you think is cool, suggest to hang out, right? Like make a friend. It's almost corny, but it's a true tragedy, right? That in big cities, lonely people live next to each other, above each other, and under each other.
Yeah.
So many people wish desperately for someone to want to be their friend, and don't really think about approaching other people and suggesting to be friends, because they're so afraid of how that might be perceived, or maybe of the rejection that comes, right?
Yeah.
And so to talk to somebody that you like at some group, realize this feels nice, I like this person's energy.
Yeah.
And then to push yourself, just like maybe you would have earlier in life, or maybe you will later in life, if you're divorcing, to push yourself to say, this is great, I'm really enjoying this conversation. Do you want to hang out later? Just that.
Right.
If nothing else, think about it as a low stakes way of practicing dating.
Right.
And just like with that, like some people will say, maybe, and some people will say, yes, that'll be great. And you'll realize that they are exactly you, but you were brave for both of you, right? So reaching out, make a friend, and then keep the friendship alive. Offer to meet, on the weekend, every other weekend, every month, whatever is a tolerable frequency for you, but just make a friend. Friends don't appear magically. You make them.
And just like relationships, your intimate relationships, like they have to be nurtured. You have to actually reach out and schedule things, and right, like you've got to water that, or it's going to dry up and shrivel away.
And I'm not suggesting that what every guy wants deep down inside is a opportunity to go spend time with a friend and watch a movie and cry and try different ice creams and I don't know what different shaving creams. Friendships can look very different, obviously. Right. And it's still very comforting if you just have a friend to go hiking together and talk about whatever. But when something real is happening, again, to be brave and to be able to answer when somebody says, "How's your week been?" Just to say, "Not great," and leave it to the other person then to dig it out of you. They'll want to dig it out, right? But just like admit something is off and don't brush it aside. Oh, whatever, home. The wife's, like, no, talk about it. It's like, I don't know. I feel like we're just not connecting lately or whatever it is.
Yeah, to be actually honest and authentic about it. It's interesting when you said, to reach out if you're hanging out with somebody and then be like, hey, this is really great. Do you want to hang out later? One of the first things that came to my mind was how much men are generally and historically, I think that this is changing, thank God, but conditioned that like the worst thing that they can be is either gay or like a woman. And so the idea that you say to someone like, hey, this is great. Do you want to hang out later? My immediate response was like, they're going to be like, whoa, what are you talking about, man? I'm not right like that. And whether it's overt like that, it's not going to be as cartoonish and overt, but like how much do you think that plays into this? That like, well, I don't want him to think I'm gay. I'm like asking him on a date. Like,
yeah, I think it's totally real. I think so. When I practice jujitsu, and in jujitsu, I occasionally meet friends. And I remember the first friend I met when I moved to New Haven. You get a good sense of people when you're sparring with them. I mean, the energy is very clear. And we talk a little bit before and a little bit after. And at some point I pushed myself to be brave. I just moved here, right? And I said, well, this is great. Do you want to hang out sometimes? And he was like, sure. What do you want to do? And I said, oh, no, maybe we'll go hiking. He's like, okay. And we did that. And then at some point, it was probably toward the end, or like we were saying goodbye or whatever it was. And like we had a great walk, a great talk. It was super fun. And then I said, this was a great first date. And his eyes opened really big. We stayed very good friends after that, but it took him a couple of years to say, yeah, I was a little confused. Like, so I kind of pushed it at that point by calling it that. Like, that was probably not the best move, but that's classic me. But, he was thinking about it, is what I know, right? He was kind of worried.
Did you feel that he resisted the friendship after that?
Not at all.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh, okay.
No, he did not. I mean, we talked about it pretty soon after, although again, it took him time to reach full admission that he was very confused at the beginning. But I do think it's a thing. I do think, like you said, a lot of men have been brought up being very worried about acting gay or about acting feminine. Mm-hmm. And it's very surmountable, right? I think you can say, like, do you want to hang out sometimes? It's open enough. It's kind of innocent enough, at least in my mind. If the other person is so worried that immediately the other person backs away and runs away screaming and goes to do masculine things because he came into contact with somebody who wanted to hang out with him, then okay, be friends with somebody else. Like, it's not a big deal. And, this is not what you're going to get shamed over on Instagram. Nobody's going to say, oh, you're honest, if I want to hang out, how awkward. Like,
right.
People ask to hang out. Like, it's okay. Again, I think part of me wants to spend less time focusing on this, right? I want to focus on how likely it is that the other person will be delighted and grateful that you approach them because they want friends too and they don't know how to do it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's so important, right? We're all like, if someone calls me, is like, hey, do you want to have dinner? I'm like, oh, yes, I do.
I'm so hungry. How did you know?
I'm like, yes, I've been sitting in my house for like a week straight. Yes, I would love to have dinner. Right. And and I think after the pandemic, like it just everything changed it's just a different
baseline shifted. We're more accepting of loneliness.
Yeah. Right. For better or worse. All right. We need to take another break. And when we come back, I want to talk more about parenting and helping divorced dads stay connected with their kids when they start to feel more disenfranchised.
Two of my favorite topics.
Woohoo! We will be right back. Okay, so divorcing dads, staying more connected to their children. I remember when I got divorced, we were talking about who was going to keep the house and who was going to leave the house. And I was, at the time, I had been a stay-at-home mom for, a couple of years. And really that was my job. And I was like, well, obviously I keep the house. Like, let's keep everything, consistent for my son, which is one of the biggest mistakes women make, especially stay-at-home moms. But that's another episode. But I said it was all about like, let's keep everything consistent for my son. And what my husband said at the time, he said, Kate, I'm already disenfranchised. I'm already like one step removed from his life by the nature of the fact that I leave the house every day and I'm gone for like 8 or 9 hours. And he said, if I keep the house, at least one thing stays consistent for him. And he's like, if I'm like this sort of person that kind of comes and goes, and then I move to some strange place, he's like, then I'm like really far more disconnected. And so in that moment, I was like, yeah, you're right. You're right. That's 100% correct. And so there is this sort of, especially in a culture where there's maybe a working dad and a stay-at-home mom, which is still so prevalent. There is this disenfranchisement of the dad. And so I just want to talk about like how can dads stay more connected?
How old was your son at the time?
He was 3.5.
Oh.
Yeah.
And you're saying that you feel like it's a mistake to focus on maintaining consistency?
Oh, you mean for me to stay in the house and be consistent?
Yeah.
No, sorry. The biggest mistake that women make is thinking that they need to stay in the house when they actually can't afford it. It's a terrible financial decision for them. That's the biggest mistake that women make. And also thinking, what my husband said at the time was, he said, Kate, wherever you go is home for him. The house is just a house. Right. But for your relationship with him, because I was so bonded with him, he's like, wherever you go is home. Yeah. And I felt like that was really true. And it proved to be true. And it all worked out well in the end. It's been, 15 years and everything's just hunky dory. And I've got a 19-year-old storming around my house. So that was what I was saying was, yes, that was the biggest mistake was.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that when thinking about creating consistency for kids, especially really young kids, I think it's less about consistency from before the separation or divorce to after. Mm-hmm. More about making sure that at some point pretty soon we land on something that stays consistent for a long time.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree.
If things change, if everybody moves out and gets their own, like that's okay as long as those places can be maintained, ideally. As long as the daily routine can be maintained, the visitation routine can be maintained, whatever it is.
Right. So minimize transitions and changes.
Minimize changes, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with that.
Okay. And you were asking a different question.
Which is about
a related question about disenfranchisement.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
And how to what can be done to help dads stay more connected specifically to their kids.
Yeah.
Maybe from the kid's side and then from the dad's side, just to help the dad experience less violent disruptions throughout the divorce. I'm focusing on the dads now but obviously this is, I think, true for both sides. Violent disruptions are bad for most people, but the dads are often uniquely ill-equipped to handle them. They look like they're doing fine until they don't. Really big picture, I think separations and divorces and dissolutions can be put into one of two categories: more or less collaborative and amicable, more or less contentious and conflictual. When there's any kind of disagreement, my strong impression, I will say, is that usually the women kind of appropriate the kids pretty early on, and the system backs it up, especially for when young kids are involved. And then it's a process of dads working hard to regain access to the kids. That's been my impression. And that is extremely destabilizing for the dads, right? Because now, again, this place of connection, maybe the one person, if the kid is who they were silly and open and vulnerable with, there's less of that. There's strong implicit messaging, right? You're not somehow good enough to be with the kids and so on. I think that's super disruptive and problematic. And of course, if the mom is on board with making sure that the dad has good, significant access to the kid to the amount that the dad wants or more, right? To make sure that the dad is an equal parent, basically. If the mom is on board, then maybe that's no longer a conflictual separation, right? But when the mom is not on board, then what do? You can't see the kids when you're not allowed to see the kids. It becomes really tricky. I would say a couple of things. Most importantly, for the dads to use whatever time they have with the kids to be 100% present with the kids during that time. It could become unbelievably precious quality time, right? And maybe if you see the kids for a couple of hours, a couple of times a week, but you do nothing but be with the kids during that time, strong connection can be fostered and maintained. Sometimes the connection strengthens during times like this because you allow yourself zero distractions. There is no phone. You're not doing other things.
Right.
You're just spending time together, whether your kid is 6 months old or 6 years old or 12 years old. It's super high quality time. And that does a lot, right? Because it also grounds the dad in the reality that there is somebody who cares about him and about whom the dad cares very much. And this is that huge protective factor, right? Step 3 in don't kill yourself, right? Have a strong connection. And so squeezing all of the juice from the times together with the kids, I think is incredibly important. And simultaneously accepting the fact that we don't control the other parent. We don't control how they're parenting. We can discuss things, but to avoid becoming this remote control parent and criticizing and because almost 100% of the time, both parents mean very well. And nobody knows what's the actually right thing to do. It's just they're both doing their best. And so to spend less time critiquing and bickering and fighting about that kind of stuff and just being like the absolute awesomest parent you can be when you're with your kid, not the best in the sense that like you bring all the gifts and you're always doing that, be fully present. That's what they want. The kids just want your presence, extra time in your kiss, as Prince so adequately put it.
That's right.
Tom Jones before, right? It's what they want. And so just to be fully awesomely present and prioritize that over everything. Meetings cannot happen during that time. No. Phones cannot happen during that time. No. And that does a lot to establish connection.
And we're so sorely lacking that actually in all of our relationships and all of the connections that we have, right?
Presence.
I mean, the presence, like full presence, no phones, all of that. That's hard to come by.
Yeah, it's precious. English has this really beautiful expression, to pay attention. I don't know that expression in any other language. And I think it's a really wonderful expression because it really is the only currency we have. And it is so precious, right? When you're giving somebody your attention like that, you're actually giving something you can never get back. Right? My attention right now.
Yeah.
And people understand this on a visceral level. When someone is tuning in and really paying attention to them, when somebody's listening to you, is caring about you, is attending to you, there's really nothing more precious.
So true. Whether it's your parent, I mean, your parent, your best friend, whoever, right? It is really just such a beautiful thing. What do you see in just culturally where we're at with divorce? How best can we begin to support divorcing dads in a better way? And also in ways that they'll show up for, that works for them, right? That like that one-on-one invitation as opposed to like, come to this big group that, men don't really feel comfortable doing, right? Like you said, I think before we hit record, we were talking about how like they'll DM you, but like invite them to a group program or like a Zoom like support group when they're like, oh.
Yeah, it takes a lot of trust building, I think, to show up to a group. You have to at least trust the facilitator, probably spend some time building trust with the group members. So I think it starts with lower asks, right? So an ask like, watch a video, see a podcast, talk to a friend, things like that, I think are great stepping stones. And it's not that everybody has to go to a support group, although probably most people would benefit from it. If the divorce is at all contentious, it's one of the worst things that can happen to people in their lives. Like it's sort of easy to discount it in real time if you're trying to be a capital M man. The reality is it's probably one of the worst things that'll ever happen to you. And it's long. It's this extended train wreck. Again, especially if it's contentious, even if it's amicable, it's shocking.
It's incredible. It is shocking. It is very shocking to people how long it takes. It really is.
Everything changes. Like when we think about times to be careful, right? People say don't introduce too many changes at once. Stress really spikes during changes. Your immune system goes down, your sleep goes wonky. So what are the kinds of things that are considered major life events? Some are good, like getting married. That's a big deal. Switching jobs. Moving to a new home, getting married, like I said, or moving in with somebody, losing somebody that you love, somebody died, losing a lot of your money suddenly, things like all of these things are likely to happen during a divorce to both people.
Right. Exactly.
It's like
Check,
all of the
check,
things
check.
together. So it's probably a good idea to talk to somebody. And a support group, why not? I think one great place to start, my fantasy is that professionals that are meeting people as they're divorcing would have more awareness of this and suggest resources to people. So almost everybody will go through a mediator initially. Almost everybody. Essentially everybody, you know what, even if they don't go to a mediator, are going to go through family relations in court just to file something if they were married.
Yeah.
And then there's the family lawyers, also known as the divorce lawyers. These professionals can be an amazing source of information where they don't just hand out, things like do's and don'ts during mediation sessions, but just part of that same package is one flyer that says, here are resources. Here are resources for men. Here are resources for women. Here are resources for genderqueer folks. Here, there's a bunch of resources, and to just list this, I think, would normalize and be amazing. And I think well worth, spending 5 minutes at the beginning or the end of the first mediation session, especially the individual one. Often it starts with individual sessions, right?
That's right. I mean, I could not agree more. And it's interesting because I've been a divorce coach for longer. I'm considered one of the pioneers of the divorce coaching industry. Like I started divorce coaching like 12 years ago, before it was a thing. It didn't have like now there's like certification programs. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Getting attorneys on board with like what we do was such a huge thing for me that even like, I think it was like 5 years ago before the pandemic. Yeah, it was like 5 or 6 years ago. I was on a panel at a mediation conference talking to mediators about what divorce coaches do. And they were all kind of like, right. They were skeptical of the whole thing. And I went back to the same conference like a couple of months ago. And one of a mediator who sort of is considered sort of like the grandfather of mediation, right? Woody Mostyn, he was talking about the importance of divorce coaches in the process. And I was like crying. I was like, thank you, Woody. Because 5, 6 years ago, he was like,
That's great.
And so, right. And so I do think, and the thing is that people will listen to their divorce attorney. They're like hanging on their every word, right? So if the attorney was like, and also, by the way, here are the resources.
Listen carefully because every second I'm talking here is costing you $3. So
that's right. That's right.
Make these words count.
Right. And so here are other resources that, by the way, are not going to cost as much and are going to actually make this time more efficient.
Yeah. So I think that the gatekeepers are a big fantasy of mine to bring them on board. The mediators, I guess the divorce coaches, family relations in court should have big signs for support groups, which they don't, which I find shocking. The lawyers would be nice. The other thing, of course, is people. There's a silence around divorce, right? It's something you don't really talk about when it's happening to somebody near you. It's a little bit like leprosy. Like if somebody's parent dies, you at least talk to them. You say how you're doing. You put a hand on their shoulder. You check what's up, and you ask if they need help with something. If somebody had a baby born, then you say, how are you doing? And would you like to run away?
Things.
When a divorce is happening, you kind of, you might say, how's it going? But like nobody really wants to talk about it usually.
I don't want to know. Right. Exactly. I don't really want to know.
And I think that to be the person who does care can make a huge difference. And so I think getting it into our heads that if somebody we know is going through a divorce, we should be talking with them at least weekly, and we don't have to dig for problems, and they may not disclose, but for them to know that we're there. And maybe occasionally we can ask a little bit more pointedly, how are you feeling? Right? How are you doing? I know or heard divorce can be really hard. How's it going for you? Just to be there for that person, I think is hugely important.
I agree. And I think some people are so scared of it. It's like the third rail, or they think it's like you said, like leprosy, like it's catching. Like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get near it because like it might rub off on me. Well, yeah, if it might. And if it does, then that's because there's a problem that perhaps it's revealing for you, but it's also not about you. Let's have it just be about them, right? Let's just be there and support them.
And there's an equal kind of shame that people experience around talking about the dissolution of their primary relationship, right? Something went very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Either I did something wrong or I picked a really wrong person, or like
Mm-hmm.
somehow it's my fault, somehow it's their fault. Moving toward a sense of this was not a good match, or this stopped being a good match, and accepting the fact that relationships are made up of two people and nobody has to be guilty of anything. It's okay for it to just not work and to lose some of the shame around it. At the same time, it's wonderful to have people in your corner saying, oh yeah, this other person is totally crazy. Like, it's kind of a nice thing, and it's okay to have people in your corner. I have a friend from grad school, and we made an agreement once that whenever we called each other to complain about our romantic partner, the other person would say, well, she's immature and you're right.
Yeah.
And it's just so nice to have somebody tell you that, regardless of what is actually happening, and then you can have a serious conversation.
That's right. That's right. I love that. I love that. Eran, this has been such a great conversation. Where can people find more? Where can they find you and all the things that you have to offer?
For divorcing dads, the place to go is divorcingdads.org.
Okay.
There's also a podcast starting right now called Divorcing Dads, where I talk with dads as they're going through the divorce process. And we're doing a lot to mask their identity and protect the privacy of their family. But hearing them process this in real time and months into the process, right? We start a couple months after and we go like a year later. And just to hear how people are doing and how they're thinking through it, I think can be a really nice kind of orienter.
Wow, that's great.
And on divorcingdads.org, there are other resources, things to read, and there is a support group for people who are interested in being brave and showing up. And I was telling you before we started recording too, I'm trying to start this model where you get essentially a sponsor, like somebody who's been through it, gone through it. Somebody who's 5 years in can talk to somebody who's 2 weeks in or 2 months in. So all that is there. And then general parenting work is at parentingforhumans.com, not about divorce. It's just about how to have a good connection with your kids and enjoy them.
Divorcingdads.org. I think it sounds great. And I'm going to send all the people there. And I think a lot of my listeners who are, well, first of all, I have a lot of listeners who are men, go there. Please go there. They're constantly asking me, who is doing this work for, who's a man doing this work for men? Here you are. Here you are.
Me. It's me.
That's it. That's right. Divorcingdads.org. And I get a lot of women saying how can I help my husband find support? So here you are.
I'll add just on that point, because for the same reason that men are often wary of reaching out and asking for support, people are often wary of suggesting that they seek support. And I think it's a fair thing to be concerned about, right? The referral needs to be done correctly. So I just want to leave people who are hearing this and maybe know somebody who's getting divorced, or maybe they themselves are getting divorced and feeling kind of despairing. One thing that dads universally care about is making sure that their kids are okay. One thing that will often give significant pause to dads who are seriously considering disconnecting because maybe they think they're no good. Maybe they think their kids will be better without them. Maybe they think that there's no way they could make it happen, or they're getting tired. For somebody to say your kids need you, your kids' lives will be better with you in it. It's a shocking thing to hear when you are in a place of deep despair and really starting to believe that your kids are better off without you. And so if you are a divorcing dad, or if you have a divorcing dad in your life, rather than encourage them to get support just for themselves, which is an angle that may or may not work. You know that person or yourself, so you decide. But it's also fair game to say, do this for your kids so you can be a fully present dad, so you can enjoy your life, so they can enjoy having you in their life because they need you, because you will make their lives better. That's an alternate or maybe an adjunct form of appeal that I think connects very powerfully with parents in general, including dads.
I think that's really beautiful. I think you're right. And I think, most of us would do things for our children that we would never do for ourselves, right? So I like that approach. Eran, thank you so much for being here. It's been really a pleasure. And everyone head over to divorcingdads.org and get all the scoop.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at The Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.